Elena Burgess, 11/7/21. Okay, so for my first case, I chose case 2. And as for what muscle glycogen is used for normally during exercise and how it's used, it is a very important part of your overall ability to exercise and your total endurance. So it plays a huge role in how long you're able to exert yourself physically. Your body, especially your muscles, which you use primarily during exercise, use what's known as ATP as their source of energy, but we have to get that ATP from somewhere. And we have a molecule called glycogen that comes commonly from carbohydrates, which is stored in your muscle fibers. And those glycogen stores are broken down into what are called glucose molecules, and glucose is a type of sugar. And those molecules are then going to go through a process called glycogenolysis. In this process, there is an enzyme that is called Glycogen Phosphorylase. And what that does is it comes and it essentially attacks that entire glycogen molecule. And when doing this, it phosphorylates or breaks down that molecule into different pieces. So when these pieces break off, they break off into these individual glucose molecules. And once we have those molecules, our body moves into a step that is known as glycolysis. In glycolysis, those glucose molecules are broken down even further, and during that step of breaking them down, it releases energy in the form of what I mentioned earlier called ATP. So if you think about if you were to snap a pencil in half, when you snap it, there's kind of a release of energy at the point that it breaks. It makes a sound, it just releases an overall amount of energy. You can think of that the same way as when you break down that glucose molecule and you break the bonds that hold the molecule together, it releases energy as well. So that's where, that energy comes from. That's what that ATP is. And once we have that ATP, it is then used as essentially the whole power source for our muscles, which ultimately, through many other steps and phases, allows for muscle contraction. So we start with that muscle glycogen, we break it down until we eventually get to ATP, and that ATP is what's used to power our muscles. As for the next question, as far as being able to take long walks, and if you're still going to be able to do that, in this case, what we're seeing is likely called McArdle's disease, and that is caused by that lack of muscle glycogen phosphorylase that we found. And when it comes to exercising, you are more likely to tire very fast, and with any strenuous activities especially. With walking, you can typically tolerate that better as long as you stay at a very gentle pace. It's important to take breaks and let yourself recover. Often in McArdle syndrome, we see what's called the second wind effect. And after about 5 to 8 minutes of some physical activity and some rest, you'll get what you feel like is a second wind that'll allow you to keep going. But with more strenuous activities, no, you probably would not be able to do that with your friends. But as far as a walk goes, the length might have to be shortened a bit. But if you keep it at a gentle pace, you should still be able to go on those walks. As a result of this deficiency and needing to maintain your blood glucose levels, you shouldn't need to wake up during the night to eat, per se. The deficiency does not inhibit your body from breaking down that glycogen into glucose, or it does inhibit your body from breaking down that glycogen into glucose, but not to the point where you would need to eat throughout the night, especially since you aren't really exerting yourself, you're fully in a rested state. When the time comes that you want to go on one of those walks with your friends, however, it would be helpful to eat or drink some extra. A drink with something like sucrose in it, which is an alternative form of sugars, is something that's found to be quite helpful because your body can't get that glucose. So having that sucrose as another form of sugar, another form of energies, can be helpful, as well as eating some additional carbohydrates, just because there is some glucose that is still able to be produced and needed throughout the rest of your body, and your liver would be the one to do that. So when you eat more carbohydrates, your liver can still process those in a way that your muscles cannot, and that glucose is used elsewhere in your body. And as far as producing excessive lactate goes during anaerobic exercises, it's more likely that you will see the opposite of that effect. So while your body contracts, while your muscles contract, you produce what is called lactate. And in someone who has the same deficiency that you have, glucose is not being produced. So someone who does not have this deficiency, that glucose is being used as energy, as like an energy source for the muscle, and the lactate that is produced is left over at the end. In your case, you don't have that glucose or that ATP for your muscle to be absorbing and using as energy. So instead, during exercise, your muscle still is producing that lactate during muscular contractions, but it also is using that lactate as an alternative form of energy because it doesn't have that glucose or ATP. So when all is said and done, after you've gone for those walks, after you've done some type of anaerobic exercise, you will actually not have lactate left over because your body has been using that for your muscles. For my second case, I chose to do case number 3, which referenced the 5-year-old boy brought into the doctors. And the biochemical basis for the patient's symptoms kind of comes from a few different factors. So the boy's baseline serum insulin is 0.8, and in a healthy child, it's typically quite a bit higher than that. And the same thing goes for the levels seen 1 hour after glucose load. His serum levels are lower than what a healthy child of that age we would typically see. So what this is most likely to imply would be hyperglycemia. And the symptoms, as well as the serum insulin levels, point to this diagnosis. So the symptoms also line up with that. In hyperglycemia, the body really can't keep up with the absorption of glucose into the cells due to a lack of insulin, which is what facilitates that. And that's seen by the low insulin levels. So his serum insulin is low. That low insulin also prevents an uptake of glucose into the cells. And when there is too much glucose in the body that your cells aren't taking up, your kidneys begin to take the brunt of that additional glucose, trying to filter it out, absorb it, kind of flush it through your body. So this increases filtration in your kidneys, which then increases the need to urinate, which is one of his symptoms. And that can also lead to dehydration, which is going to increase his overall thirst, which is another one of his symptoms. And glucose is also a very important form of energy for cells, like I had mentioned in the previous case. So with glucose not being absorbed by the cells, they are not in turn getting that energy that they're used to, that energy they need, which would kind of lead to that very drowsy, lethargic type of symptom that they had seen. As far as his fasted blood glucose levels, I would expect the fasted blood glucose levels to be above a normal range. In the case of this boy, the insulin levels in his body are so low in comparison to a healthy level, even in a baseline sample. And like I had mentioned, insulin's main function is to facilitate that absorption of glucose throughout the body into cells where they can break it down and use it for energy. So with his insulin levels being so low, a lot of that glucose stays intact, moving throughout the body. And without it being absorbed, it would increase that level of glucose seen in his body to an above average level, even during a fasted state. And based on this diagnosis, 2 regulatory enzymes that are likely to be active in his condition, I think kind of play off of what his body would be requiring. So carbohydrates is where a lot of our body's glucose supply comes from and where a lot of our energy comes from, and is typically used as the first form of energy. In this case, because glucose cannot be used adequately for that, the body's next form of energy would be coming from the breakdown of fats and proteins. And each of those kind of have an important enzyme attached that would give our 2 enzymes we'd be expecting to see active. So one of those enzymes would be lipase, which acts by breaking down fats into its smaller subunits, fatty acids, which are then used to create energy for cells. And when the body kind of gets into that fatty acid stage, it converts them to ATP. And then the second enzyme I think we would see would be pepsin, because that's the enzyme that is responsible for breaking down proteins into amino acids, which can be absorbed by the body and used for energy. But fat, I think overall we would see a bit more of that lipase activity, because fats do yield the most energy. They yield 9 calories. So I think we would see a lot more of that lipase over the pepsin, but I think we'd be seeing both, because the body would be kind of pulling more of that to replenish what it's not getting from breaking down carbohydrates.